There's always a bit of nostalgia. There's always a bit of happiness in thinking that you may know things and all that. Especially when you see a team leave a city for another city. It just makes you sad if you're a hardcore fan. Some cities say that, well, good riddance, our team's out of our city. We don't have any emotional attachments. But a lot of cities do, especially in the NHL. I mean, there's been lots of relocations of franchises and all that. And cities get upset and all that. The Hartford Whalers are a good example. Moving to Carolina, and Hartford had a good piece of the sports action in Connecticut. I mean, you don't really think Connecticut has a major league team, which they don't really do anymore. I mean, heck, when Atlanta lost both the Flames and the Thrashers to other cities, I mean, some Atlanta fans might have cried, but not too many. I mean, people didn't really miss them that much. But when you take away a team from a Canadian city and put it in the American South because you just want hockey to thrive in the American South at the risk of pissing off Canadians who basically built this game and all of that, you gotta hate on Gary Bettman so much. Anyway, let's talk about the Winnipeg Jets. Not the current Winnipeg Jets, but the old school Winnipeg Jets, the Jets slash Coyotes in this video. Hello out there, we're on the air. It's Cutter with NHL time. Tensions blow, the whistle blown, and the pucks go down the ice. Some teams just want to win the cup and do it with a smile. Hey, that is cool. Up on the River Nile. Oh, the good old hockey game. Who will come out on top? Will a team get through the cup to the cup by any means necessary? Oh, the good old hockey game. It's the best game you can name. And I'm have no shame. I will simulate those hockey games. Woo! So the Winnipeg Jets were born out of the WHA, the World Hockey Association, the league that was formed to try to put pressure on the NHL to get unknown players and to make the NHL maybe expand or care about cities and all that. So Winnipeg were one of the original WHA teams for the 1972-73 season. And Winnipeg needed to make a splash. And Ben Hatskin, the guy who owned the Jets, kind of figured he needed some help. So he finds Bobby Hall, who's having contract problems with the Hawks in the NHL, and basically said, join this upstart league. Hall scoffs and basically tells him that I'll join if you give me $1 million, not realizing that Hatskin had the $1 million. So with that $1 million check, and it was not $1 million at one time, it was $1 million over 10 years. So it was $100,000 per year. If you will. Remember, this is 1972. Three of Bobby's five sons were there for the contract signing and all that, and one of them flung it and it lost it at someone else's ear. Brett was not there. Brett Hall was at home. Nevertheless, Winnipeg became a very good team. They became one of the most established WHA teams around, staying for the whole time and having Bobby Hall do well. In fact, they broke the mold when they picked up Anders Hedberg and Lars Erik Skolberg and put them on the same line with Bobby Hall. I mean, Winnipeg modernized European scouting. Even the Jets in the 80s and 90s did so too, putting emphasis on Europeans to join a Canadian slash American game. It worked out. The Jets were one of the four teams that would go from the WHA to the NHL for the 1979-80 season. And in essence, they actually won the last AFCO Cup, aka the WHA Championship. So Winnipeg looked good. Unfortunately, though, in 1980, they sucked. They actually beat Colorado on the final day of the regular season. Why is that win big? Because that win actually was not supposed to be a win. The Jets were told, don't beat Colorado because that means that Colorado would have the number one draft pick. Unfortunately, they did. Winnipeg won the game. They missed out on the number one pick. They had the number two pick. But the number two pick wasn't that bad. I mean, Montreal had the number one pick because Colorado traded that first round pick to Montreal. And Montreal, instead of drafting hometown favorite Denny Savard, decided to go with Doug Wickenheiser of all people. Winnipeg went with, I believe it was Morris Lukowich, second overall, which was a decent pick. And then Chicago snapped out of it and took Denny Savard. Winnipeg were terrible in 1981. They only won 9 games that year. But fortunately, because they tied 14 of them, they actually were not the worst team in the NHL history. And staying out of the conversation with the 75 Capitals. Although the Winnipeg did have a 23-game winless streak. The fact of the matter is that Winnipeg were still creeping. And that 1981 season, they got Dale Hawerchuk. So they got everything they needed. So Hawerchuk helping the Jets do well in a decade's work. In 1985, Winnipeg upset Calgary and went to the division finals against the Edmonton Oilers. Unfortunately, Gretzky toyed with them, scoring 7 points in one game against the Jets, in the game that eliminated the Jets. In 1987, they decided to do a whiteout, as in have every fan wear white and wave white towels and all that. Vancouver did the white towels, but they didn't really do the white shirts. So they did the whiteout Vancouver side. Winnipeg beat Calgary to move on to the second round against those pesky Edmonton Oilers, which had lost. Little did people know that was the last time the Jets would win a playoff series in Winnipeg until the newfound Jets came home. The Jets were looking good. They drafted Teemu Selanne in the late rounds of the 1988 draft. He came through in 92-93 with the Jets and scored 76 goals, tying him for first with Alex Mogilny and really setting the record. Winnipeg started getting decent. However, Winnipeg would be also known for not finishing what they started. We're going to talk about the 1990 3-1 blow up against the Oilers. In 92, they actually had a 3-1 series lead on the Vancouver Canucks. It was Bury versus Selanne. And somehow, in some way, the Jets could not finish the job, and Vancouver got to the division finals, where they got swept by Edmonton. Winnipeg were destroyed in 93 by the Canucks on a controversial overtime goal by Greg Adams. But behind the scenes, Winnipeg was struggling. The Canadian dollar was not doing so well, and the Winnipeg Arena was not really suited for hockey. It was one of the smallest in the NHL. With that in mind, Winnipeg tried to keep their team in town. Rumors were circling after the 95 season that Winnipeg would be moving to Minnesota. After all, Minnesota did lose their hockey team a couple years earlier, and they were very close to Winnipeg geographically. That fell through as Winnipeg got the money needed to save their franchise. But unfortunately, it was the end of it. In 96, they learned that they were going to head to Phoenix. Of all places, Arizona for hockey? Really? This would be one of the first steps in Gary Bettman's master plan to make American hockey in the South great again. To paraphrase a quote from the current U.S. president. Nevertheless, Gary Bettman put more emphasis on American sovereign teams than Canadian teams and all that. You know, you could put more emphasis on like northern New York teams like Minnesota, Detroit, New York, and Chicago, and Canadians wouldn't really bat an eye. But when you favor the South over Canada, you got problems, man. So Winnipeg played Game 6 of the conference playoffs against the Detroit Red Wings, lost Game 6, and had an emotional farewell. That was big in everyone's eyes, and everyone thought that was the end of hockey in Winnipeg. For years, there was rumored that Winnipeg was going to get a team, some like Nashville or Atlanta, and basically Bettman or Phoenix, and Atlanta would, well, and Bettman would do almost everything in his power to prevent Canada from getting that team. A team in Southern Ontario, fine, you can deny that. Well, Hamilton, meh. But Winnipeg or Quebec, really? You want to screw them over? Unfortunately, though, the Thrashers were so bad, Bettman decided to finally allow the Thrashers to move back to Winnipeg. And since then, the Winnipeg Jets have done decently, but have not really had the playoff run to make people happy, aka make the finals. As of this recording, the Winnipeg Jets are in the conference semifinals against the Dallas Stars. Time will tell how good they'll be. But the fact of the matter is that let's talk about the Winnipeg Jets of 1990. All right, so the 1990 Jets were the 18th season of the Jets, and they're 11th in the NHL because of the WHA. They actually took third in the Smythe and all that. The Jets decided to get rid of John Ferguson Sr., who was a pretty good guy with the Canadiens and a decent hockey mind. They replaced him with Mike Smith, not the former Coyotes goalie, but a, a GM who actually put emphasis on trying to find European talent. He found Teppo Numminen, they found Teemu Selanne, he found Ole Tverdovsky, those guys. Bob Murdoch, former Blackhawk player, would be named the new head coach. And at the 1989 draft, they had the fourth overall pick and took Stu Barnes from the Tri-City Americans, team in Washington State. He looks pretty good. They even took Chris Draper in the third round and future NHL coach Dan Biasma in the sixth round. So a lot of people would be probably saying, did Winnipeg make the right move with number 4, Stu Barnes? Well, considering that the next pick was the Devils and they took Bill Guerin, that could have worked out well for the Jets. Bobby Holik was drafted 10th by the Whalers because Hartford kind of figured the European connection. Olaf Kolzig was drafted in the number 19 by Washington. And Stephen Rice, former Kitchener Rangers icon, was drafted by the Rangers. Well, Montreal. That was Montreal's first round pick that went because of Chris Nyland. Anyway, the Jets would actually make a move at the 1989 draft as well, as they traded Randy Gilhan, Andrew McBain, and Jim Kite to Pittsburgh for Randy Cunningworth, Rick Tabaracci, and Dave McClellan. And looked decent. Also in that draft, Winnipeg took Craig Puslowski from the Blues and exchanged third round picks with the Devils. Winnipeg actually had Pete Peters, a pretty good goalie from the Flyers. Well, the Flyers traded him to Winnipeg, but then they traded him back to Philly for the fifth round pick. And then they would trade Pokey Reddick to Edmonton for future considerations. All that, giving Edmonton 2 goalies of African American goalies, because Pokey Reddick was African American. So anyway, they decided to have a captain rotation with Randy Carlyle, Dale Hawerchuk, and Thomas Dean sharing those things. So anyway, the Jets ended up third in the division behind Calgary and Edmonton, those pesky Alberta teams. The Kings were 4 for 75. Now, this was, of course, the time that the top 4 in each division would make the playoffs. It would be 1 versus 4, 2 versus 3. As you see here, the Campbell Conference, Winnipeg would have been the 4th seed. They would have faced the St. Louis Blues in the playoffs. So they were the 4th best team in the conference. And in the playoffs, they took on the Edmonton Oilers. Shockingly, the Jets were up 3-1. How do I know this? Because Game 4, when it was on ESPN Classic Canada, when it was an active channel, would show a lot of these playoff games. And the Jets and Oilers went to double overtime, and Richard Ristolainen was in the box. And Don Whitman and is a color commentator. I think it might be John Garrett. Might have been John Garrett. But anyway, they were discussing whether Winnipeg should have gotten a penalty shot. But anyway, 2 seconds after the puck was dropped in the faceoff, Dave Ellett, future Leaf, from the point scores, and the Jets were up 3-1 on the Oilers. And basically, Bill Ranford was being soft. A lot of people said Grant Fuhr should be back in the net for the Oilers. But Edmonton rode with Ranford, and for some strange reason, the Oilers won 3 straight games after that double overtime debacle. The Oilers would take care of the LA Kings in the division finals after LA took care of Calgary thanks to Mike Krusheletsky's floating overtime goal. And then Edmonton would shock Chicago thanks to Messier's performances to get to the Stanley Cup Finals against the Bruins and shock them in 5. Nevertheless, Dale Hawerchuk, this was a good season for him. Unfortunately, this would also be his last season with the team. Well, anyway, see the trades and all that. Yeah, they traded away Peters and Acton back. They picked up Paul McDermott from Hartford for Randy Cunningworth. So they traded Cunningworth back to Hartford. And they traded Daniel Bethune to Minnesota. Mo Manfo was picked on waivers. But the Jets traded away Dale Hawerchuk in their first round pick in 1990 to Buffalo for Scott O'Neill, Phil Housley, Jeff Parker, and their first round pick. It worked out well. Phil Housley was a pretty good defenseman for Winnipeg. All that. And of course, as you see, the first round pick in 1990 was Keith Tkachuk. So the Jets drafted with Buffalo's pick Keith Tkachuk, and it worked out well for the Jets/Coyotes. Hawerchuk would do fine for Buffalo before injuries would hurt him. And then he was traded. I would love to say he was going to trade to the Islanders, but no. I don't know who was next for Hawerchuk. But anyway, Buffalo, with that first round pick, took Brad May, and he was the hero 3 years later in the playoffs. So yeah, they picked up Stu Barnes, Chris Draper, Dan Biosma, and Sergei Karin. I have his rookie card. So yeah, that's what happened to the Jets and all that. So what would have happened if the Jets actually did take care of business with the Oilers and faced the Kings in the playoffs? Let's find out. So the 1990 Winnipeg Jets would have had home ice against the LA Kings because, well, they were the 3 seed. The Kings were the 4 seed in the division. So yeah, the Kings would face the Jets. So Gretzky would have to face Hawerchuk. And those two were teammates on the 87 Canada Cup team. So anyway, Winnipeg would have hosted game 1. And it would have been a Fisher's game. It was 9 goals in the first period, but they lost the game 7-5. The Jets had goals by Pat Elionek, Dale Hawerchuk, Doug Evans, and then Hawerchuk again. The Kings countered with Dave Taylor, John Tonelli, Thomas Sandstrom, and Bob Kudelski. Nichols would score to make it 5-5, and then Gretzky and McSorley in the third period. Surprised both teams didn't change the goalies and all that. Rudy, Hawerchuk, and Elionek were the 3 stars. Yeah, Rudy gave up 65 shots to Winnipeg and did all that. Kind of cool, huh? Game 2 would see the Jets lose 9-7. Yeah, it's firebrand hockey. But yeah, Winnipeg would have lost 9-7. First period, the Jets were up 3-1 on goals by Pat Elionek, Dale Hawerchuk, and then Paul Fenton on the power play. The Kings scored a goal with Todd Ellick. Bernie Nichols made it 3-2 for the Kings and then scored again to make it 3-3. Thomas Dean made it 4-3, and then Hawerchuk made it 5-3 as Mario Goslin was now in the net for the Kings. Gretzky scored to make it 5-4. Krasnowski made it 5-5, and then the Jets were up 6-5 in the third, but Bernie Nichols got a hat trick goal. Kudelski scored to make it 7-6. Hawerchuk scored at 17:35 to tie it at 7. But with a minute and 19 left, Robitaille scored thanks to a Peter Tagliani penalty to make it 8-7. Randy Carlyle got in trouble for clipping, and then Thomas Sandstrom scored in the empty net. Kings win 9-7. They still couldn't find time for Steve Duchesne, Larry Robinson, Kitchener, and Ken Baumgartner. Winnipeg only had Freddie Olsen for 53 seconds, Lloyd Boschman, Teppo Newman, and Brett Hughes for not so much. So Goslin got the win. Nichols, Hawerchuk, and McSorley are 3 stars. So they head to the Forum for Game 3. And the Jets would foul things up, losing 8-4 as the Kings look like they're going to knock down the Winnipeg Jets. Pat Elionek, Dale Hawerchuk, and Thomas Dean scored for Winnipeg. Bernie Nichols scored. So it was 3-1. But then Taylor, Jay Miller, and Sandstrom made it 4-3 in the second period. Dave McElwain got in trouble for an unsportsmanlike conduct penalty. Gretzky scored in the power play, making it 5-3. Nichols made it 6-3. Doug Evans made it 6-4. With the Kings 2 goals by Jay Miller and Wayne the Millway Gretzky. Yeah. 4 seconds for Larry Robinson. Yikes. Nicholas J. Miller, of all people. Well, you did score 2 goals and an assist. Gretzky, the third start. Man, Jay Miller would be really happy. Steven Beauregard was not really ready. Game 4 would see the Winnipeg Jets get their butts handed to 11-4. Unreal that Winnipeg could not do anything against the Kings, and Gretzky would be going to the Stanley Cup semifinals with the Kings. Duchesne, Sandstrom, and Tonelli made it 3-0 Kings. Jet made it 3-1 Hawerchuk. Sandstrom would score 2 more goals to get a hat trick and chase Essence up. Paul McDermott made it 5-2. Ellernick made it 5-3 for the Jets. And then Gretzky scored on the power play. And then Robitaille on the power play. Krasheneski and John Tonelli. So you can kind of guess that everything was for shit. 65 shots by the Kings on net. They couldn't give Larry Robinson more than 45 seconds of ice time? Yeesh. Sandstrom, Robitaille, and Nichols, the 3 stars of the game. Beauregard did well, but he gave up 6 shots on 6 goals on 53 shots. Well, at least his save percentage was better than Essensa. Essensa almost gave up as many goals as he had made saves. So Essensa was just not ready. I think the Jets would have probably got their butts handed to them. Anyway, yeah, the LA Kings sweep the Jets, get to the semifinals, and maybe Chicago wins the whole damn thing. But yeah, Winnipeg would have got into the second round and once again fallen. And maybe, things would have been better, but not really. Anyhow, I'm Jeff Diamond to do.